A 65-year-old man sold everything he owned to save one of his adopted twin daughters. On his 70th birthday, when the girls handed him a package, his hands trembled at what he discovered. Harold Thompson's knees cracked as he knelt in his garden, pulling weeds from around his wife's prized roses. The morning sun beat down on his neck, and sweat trickled down his spine. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped another stubborn dandelion. Martha would have had these out weeks ago, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. The roses weren't doing well this year. 5 years since Martha's passing, and he still couldn't get them right. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock echoed through the empty house behind him. That damn clock. Martha had loved it, said it gave the house a heartbeat. Now it just reminded Harold of how quiet everything else was. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. The smell of coffee drifted from his forgotten mug on the porch steps. Probably cold by now. Like everything else in his life these days. The mail truck rumbled past his driveway, and Harold watched as the carrier stuffed a handful of envelopes into his mailbox. Bills, probably. Maybe another letter from his sister in Florida, trying to convince him to move to a retirement community. "Morning, Mr. Thompson." The mail carrier waved. Harold raised his dirt-covered hand in response, forcing a smile. He waited until the truck disappeared around the corner before walking to the mailbox. His footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. Among the usual stack of junk mail and bills, a blue envelope caught his eye. The community center logo sat in the corner. Harold had been volunteering there for the past few months, mostly watering plants and helping with basic maintenance. Anything to get out of the house. He tore open the envelope right there in the driveway. The paper was crisp, official-looking. "Dear Mr. Thompson," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Due to increased attendance in our after-school programs, we are seeking additional volunteers to assist with childcare and activities. Your dedication to our center has not gone unnoticed, and we would be grateful if you would consider expanding your role." Harold's hand dropped to his side, the letter crumpling slightly in his grip. Kids. He hadn't spent much time around children since he and Martha lost their own baby all those years ago. They tried again, but it never happened. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, the sound carrying across the yard. Harold looked at his empty house, the roses that were dying despite his best efforts, the cold coffee on the porch steps. He walked inside, his work boots leaving dirt marks on the kitchen floor. Martha would have had a fit about that. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, covered in a thin layer of dust. When was the last time it had rung? Harold picked it up and dialed the community center's number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. "Community center, this is Patricia speaking." "Patricia? This is Harold Thompson." His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. "About the volunteer letter." "Oh, Mr. Thompson. Yes, we're desperate for help with the children's program, especially now that school's starting up again." Harold's fingers tightened around the phone. "What exactly would I need to do?" "Just supervise activities, help with homework, maybe read stories. Nothing too strenuous. The kids are usually well-behaved." She paused. "We could really use someone with your patience, Mr. Thompson." The clock ticked in the background. Outside, a bird landed on the rose bush, then flew away. "I'll do it," Harold said, surprising himself. "When do you need me? Could you start tomorrow?" "Around 3. Tomorrow at 3, he repeated. "I'll be there." After hanging up, Harold stood in his kitchen for a long moment. The house felt different somehow. Less empty, maybe. Or maybe that was just his imagination. The next day, Harold parked his old Ford in the community center lot at exactly 2:45 p.m. His hands were sweating on the steering wheel. What the hell was he doing here? He wasn't qualified to work with kids. He was just an old man who couldn't even keep his wife's roses alive. But he got out of the car anyway, his knees popping as he stood. The community center was a plain brick building, but someone had painted cheerful murals on the walls. Children playing, reading, laughing. Harold touched one of the painted flowers as he walked past. The paint was rough under his fingers. Patricia met him at the door, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Right on time, Mr. Thompson. The children will be arriving from school any minute." She led him through the building to a large room filled with small tables and chairs. Art supplies were stacked on shelves along one wall, and books filled another. The windows looked out onto a small playground. The first bus usually arrives around 3, Patricia explained, handing him a name tag. Most of the children stay until 5 or 6, when their parents can pick them up after work. Some, she hesitated. Some stay later. Before Harold could ask what she meant, the sound of a school bus pulling up outside filled the room. Patricia smiled. Ready? Harold nodded, even though his heart was pounding. The doors burst open, and children flooded in, filling the quiet room with noise and movement. They hung up their backpacks on hooks along the wall, chattering and laughing. That's when he saw them. 2 little girls stood in the doorway, holding hands. They were identical twins, with dark skin and hair pulled back in neat braids. Unlike the other children, they moved quietly, staying close together. Their backpacks looked worn, the straps frayed. Sarah and Sophie, Patricia said softly beside him. 7 years old. They usually sit at that table in the corner. Harold watched as the twins made their way to their table. They pulled out homework sheets and began working, heads bent close together. Sometimes one would whisper something to the other, and they'd share a quick smile. Their mother, Patricia sighed. She's trying her best, but she has problems. The girls spend a lot of time here. As if they felt his gaze, both girls looked up at the same time. Their eyes met his, curious but cautious. Harold lifted his hand in an awkward wave. To his surprise, they waved back, small smiles appearing on their faces. Would you like to help them with their homework? Patricia asked. Harold nodded, his throat tight. He walked over to their table, his work boots heavy on the linoleum floor. The girls watched him approach, still holding hands under the table. Mind if I sit here? He asked, gesturing to an empty chair. They looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that twins sometimes do. Then they nodded in unison. I'm Mr. Thompson, he said, lowering himself into the too small chair. What are you working on? Math, one of them said softly. Her name tag read Sarah. We're learning multiplication. Yeah. Harold leaned forward, looking at their worksheets. I used to be pretty good at multiplication. Want some help? Sophie, the other twin, pushed her paper toward him. The 7s are hard, she whispered. Well, let's figure them out together, Harold said, pulling a pencil from his pocket. As he began explaining the problems, he felt something loosen in his chest. The constant ticking of his home's grandfather clock seemed very far away. The afternoon passed quickly. Harold helped other children too, but he kept finding himself drawn back to the twins' table. They were quiet but attentive, and their faces lit up when they got a problem right. When they smiled, really smiled, their whole faces changed. At 6 o'clock, most of the children had gone home. But Sarah and Sophie remained, still working on their homework. Harold noticed them sneaking glances at the clock. Patricia appeared beside him. Their mother's running late again, she said quietly. It happens sometimes. Harold looked at the girls, then at his watch. I can stay, he heard himself say, until their mother comes. Patricia squeezed his shoulder. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. It was almost 8 before a young woman rushed in, out of breath and looking exhausted. The twins grabbed their backpacks and hurried to her, but not before turning to wave goodbye to Harold. See you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson, they called in unison. Harold waved back, his chest tight. See you tomorrow, he repeated. Driving home in the dark, Harold couldn't stop thinking about those little girls. Their careful movements, their silent communication, the way they held hands under the table. How long had they been spending their evenings at the community center, waiting for someone to come get them? He pulled into his driveway, the headlights sweeping across Martha's rose garden. The flowers were just shadows in the darkness. The grandfather clock greeted him as he walked in. It's ticking loud in the empty house. But for the first time in a long time, Harold didn't notice it as much. His mind was already on tomorrow, and 2 little girls who needed help with their multiplication tables. Harold sat in the social services office, his hands folded in his lap. The plastic chair creaked every time he moved. A clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, reminding him of home. Mr. Thompson, the social worker said, looking up from her computer. Her name tag read, Ms. Jenkins. You understand this is unusual. Harold cleared his throat. Yes, you're 65, single, and you want to adopt 2 7-year-old girls. She adjusted her glasses. That's a lot to take on at your age. I know how old I am, Harold said, his voice firmer than he expected. I also know those girls need someone. Ms. Jenkins leaned back in her chair. Papers were spread across her desk. Harold's financial records, his background check, his medical history. 3 weeks of paperwork had led to this meeting. The twins have had 4 failed placement attempts, she said. Most families don't want to take siblings, especially not older ones. And with their mother's situation, she trailed off. What about their mother? Ms. Jenkins sighed. She's in and out of rehab. Signs away temporary custody, then reclaims it when she's clean. The girls have been in the system for 2 years now. Harold's fingers tightened on his knees. 2 years. He thought about Sarah and Sophie at the community center, doing their homework and waiting for hours to be picked up. I see them every day, he said. For the past month, I've been there. They're good girls. Smart girls. Mr. Thompson, they deserve a chance at stability. The social worker studied him for a long moment. Outside her office, phones rang and people talked in muted voices about other children, other families. We'll need to do a home study, she said finally. And there will be multiple interviews, background checks on anyone who regularly visits your home. Just me, Harold interrupted. Been just me since my wife passed. Something in Ms. Jenkins' face softened. The girls would need their own room. We'd have to verify your income, your health insurance, your ability to provide long-term care. Own my house outright. Got good retirement benefits from the construction union. Health insurance too. Harold sat up straighter. I can give them a good home. Ms. Jenkins made some notes on her computer. The clicking of her keyboard filled the silence. There's something else you should consider, she said, not looking up. The community's reaction. A single man your age, adopting 2 young girls, people might talk. Let them, Harold said. She finally met his eyes. And the racial aspect don't matter to me. Shouldn't matter to anyone else either. A small smile crossed Ms. Jenkins' face. No, it shouldn't. She pulled some forms from a drawer. Here's the preliminary paperwork. Fill these out, and we'll schedule the home study. Harold took the papers with steady hands. As he stood to leave, Ms. Jenkins spoke again. Mr. Thompson? Why these girls? He thought about Sarah and Sophie's quiet strength. Their small waves goodbye every evening. The way they helped each other with homework without being asked. Because they need somebody, he said simply. And maybe I need somebody too. The community center was buzzing with activity when Harold arrived that afternoon. He spotted the twins at their usual table and walked over, his folder of papers tucked under his arm. Mr. Thompson, Sophie called out, her face brightening. We got A's on our math test. Both of us, Sarah added proudly. Harold pulled up a chair. That's fantastic. Those multiplication tables paying off. Huh. The girls nodded enthusiastically. Harold noticed they were wearing the same clothes as yesterday. The sleeve of Sarah's sweater had a small tear. Hey, he said, trying to keep his voice casual. Would you girls like to see my house sometime? I got a garden that could use some help. The twins exchanged one of their silent looks. Is it far? Sarah asked. Just 10 minutes away. We'd have to ask Patricia and get permission, of course. Sophie's eyes widened. Does your house have stairs? No stairs. But there's a big backyard. And? Harold hesitated. There's a room that might make a good bedroom. If someone wanted it. The girls grew very still. They'd been in the system long enough to understand what he was suggesting. For us, Sarah whispered. Harold nodded. If you like. I've already talked to Ms. Jenkins at Social Services. Sophie grabbed her sister's hand. Both of us? Course both of you. Wouldn't dream of splitting you up. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Sophie wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. Nobody wants both of us, Sophie said quietly. They always say we're too much trouble. Harold's heart clenched. Well, I want both of you. If you'll have me. The girls launched themselves at him, wrapping their arms around his waist. Harold froze for a moment, then hugged them back, his eyes burning. Patricia watched from across the room, smiling through her own tears. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and preparations. Ms. Jenkins inspected Harold's house, making notes about needed safety modifications. Harold cleaned out the spare room, which had been serving as storage since Martha died. His neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, watched from her porch as Harold carried out boxes. Heard you're taking in those girls from the center, she called out. Harold paused, a box of Martha's old clothes in his arms. That's right. At your age? She shook her head. And she didn't finish the sentence. They are wonderful girls, Harold said firmly. Smart. Kind. That's all that matters. Mrs. Rodriguez pressed her lips together but said nothing more. The day of the girls' first home visit arrived sunny and clear. Harold had spent the morning nervously checking and rechecking the house. He'd bought new bedding for the twin beds he'd ordered, purple for Sarah, blue for Sophie, after carefully asking their favorite colors. The social worker's car pulled up at exactly noon. Harold watched through the window as she helped the girls out of the back seat. They were wearing dresses he hadn't seen before, probably provided by the agency. Welcome, he said, opening the door before they could knock. Come on in. The twins stepped inside, looking around with wide eyes. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, and sunlight streamed through the windows. Would you like to see your room? Harold asked. If you decide to stay, that is. They nodded eagerly. He led them down the hall, Ms. Jenkins following behind. When he opened the door, both girls gasped. The room was bright and clean, with freshly painted walls and new curtains. 2 identical beds sat against opposite walls, each with its own small dresser. A bookshelf stood between them, empty and waiting to be filled. Is this really for us? Sarah asked, touching the purple bedspread. All yours, Harold confirmed. We can decorate it however you like. Sophie walked to the window, which overlooked the garden. Look, Sarah. Flowers. Those were my wife's roses, Harold said. Not doing so well now, but maybe you girls could help me with them. Your wife? Sarah turned from examining her bed. Where is she? Harold's throat tightened. He took a photo from the dresser and showed it to them. Martha smiled up from the frame, her gray hair neat, her eyes kind. This is Martha. She passed away 5 years ago. The girls studied the photo carefully. Then Sophie asked, Do you miss her? Every day. We miss our moms sometimes, Sarah said quietly. Even though. She trailed off. Harold knelt down, his knees protesting. It's okay to miss people, even when they can't be with us. Sophie pointed to another photo on the wall, showing a much younger Harold and Martha. Can we put pictures up too? Course you can. It's your room. The girls explored every corner of the house after that. They looked through photo albums, asked questions about everything they saw. Harold showed them the kitchen, promising to teach them how to bake Martha's famous chocolate chip cookies. When it was time to leave, both girls hugged him tight. Can we call you Dad? Sophie whispered against his shirt. Harold's vision blurred. I'd like that very much. After they left, Harold sat in his quiet house. The grandfather clock ticked away, but the silence felt different now, full of possibility. He looked at the adoption papers on his coffee table. The process would be long, complicated, and probably difficult. Some people wouldn't understand. Others would disapprove. But when he thought of Sarah and Sophie's faces lighting up at their room, at the way they'd asked about Martha, at Sophie's whispered question, he knew it was right. Harold picked up his pen and began filling out the forms. Moving day arrived with the sunrise. Harold stood in the doorway of the girls' room, double-checking everything one last time. 2 new twin beds with fresh linens. 2 dresses, still empty, waiting to be filled. 2 matching lamps on identical bedside tables. His phone buzzed. A text from Ms. Jenkins. On our way. Girls are excited. Harold's hands shook slightly as he replied. This was really happening. After 2 months of paperwork, interviews, and home visits, Sarah and Sophie were coming home. For good. The social worker's car pulled into his driveway at exactly 9 a.m. The twins jumped out, each carrying a small backpack. Everything they owned in the world fit into those worn bags. Dad, they called in unison, running to him. The words still made his heart skip. He hugged them both, noticing how Sophie's backpack felt lighter than it should, how Sarah's jacket was a size too small. Ready to see your room again? He asked. They nodded eagerly, but Sarah hesitated. Can we bring our stuff in first? Course we can. Harold reached for their bags, but Sophie clutched hers tighter. We can carry them, she said quickly. We always carry our own stuff. Ms. Jenkins gave Harold a meaningful look. The girls had moved so many times, they'd learned to keep their belongings close. Okay, Harold said gently. Lead the way. They walked into the house, past the ticking grandfather clock that no longer seemed so lonely. The girls went straight to their room, placing their backpacks carefully on their beds. This is really ours now, Sarah asked, her voice small. Really yours, Harold confirmed. Want to unpack? The twins shared a look, then slowly unzipped their bags. Harold's throat tightened as he saw how little they had. Some worn clothes, a few school supplies, a shared stuffed bear, missing one eye. We need to do some shopping, he said, keeping his voice light. Get you girls some new clothes, school things. Whatever you need. Sophie's eyes widened. New clothes? Brand new, Harold promised. And some decorations for your room too. Sarah touched her bedspread. Can we really decorate it how we want? It's your room now. You can make it yours. The girls exchanged excited grins. Ms. Jenkins, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. I'll leave you to get settled, she said. I'll check in next week, but call if you need anything. After she left, Harold clapped his hands together. So, shopping. The mall was crowded for a Saturday morning. The girls stuck close to Harold, holding hands and looking overwhelmed by the noise and movement. Where first? He asked. Can we? Sophie started, then stopped. What is it? Sweetheart. Can we look at the clothes? She whispered. Harold smiled. Course we can. In the children's department. The twins moved cautiously through the racks, touching fabrics with careful fingers. They kept looking at price tags, then putting things back. Girls, Harold said, kneeling down to their level. Don't worry about the prices. Pick what you like. Sarah bit her lip. But, no buts. You need new clothes, and I want you to have things you love. Slowly, they began selecting items: a purple dress for Sarah, a blue sweater for Sophie, jeans without holes, shirts without stains, new shoes to replace their scuffed ones. In the fitting room, Harold heard them giggling as they tried things on. The sound made his chest warm. Dad, Sophie called. Look. She twirled in a yellow sundress, her face glowing. Sarah wore a matching one in green. Beautiful, Harold said, his voice rough. Just beautiful. They left the store with more bags than Harold could count. The girls tried to help carry them, but he shooed them away. Ice cream, he suggested, before we look for room decorations. Their faces lit up. At the ice cream shop, they sat at a small table, the shopping bags piled around their feet. Sarah got chocolate, Sophie strawberry. They kept offering Harold tastes of each. What color should we paint our walls? Sarah asked, licking her spoon. Any color you want. Really? Sophie's eyes widened. Even purple. Even purple. The home improvement store was their next stop. The girls chose a soft lavender paint for their walls, and Harold added it to their cart along with brushes and drop cloths. We can help paint, Sarah offered. Yeah, we're good helpers, Sophie added. Harold ruffled their hair. I know you are. That night, after pizza and ice cream, after new pajamas and goodnight hugs, Harold sat in his living room listening to the sounds of his newly full house. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, but now it mixed with the soft whispers and giggles coming from the girls' room. He should tell them to go to sleep. It was late, but he couldn't bring himself to stop their happiness. A small sound made him look up. Sarah stood in the hallway, clutching their old stuffed bear. Can't sleep? Harold asked. She shook her head. Sophie's asleep, but... She hesitated. Sometimes I get scared at night. In new places. Harold patted the couch beside him. Sarah curled up next to him, her small body warm against his side. Want to know a secret? He asked. She nodded. I get scared sometimes too. You do? Sure do. Especially when things change. Even good changes can be scary. Sarah hugged her bear tighter. What do you do when you're scared? Well, Harold said slowly, I think about good things. Like how brave you and your sister are. How happy you make me. She was quiet for a moment. We're happy too, she whispered. Nobody ever wanted both of us before. Harold's arm tightened around her. Well, I want both of you. Always will. Sarah yawned, her eyes drooping. Promise. Promise. When her breathing evened out, Harold carefully carried her back to her room. Sophie had rolled over in her sleep, one hand reaching toward her sister's empty bed. He tucked Sarah in, making sure her bear was secure in her arms. The next morning, they started painting. Harold showed the girls how to use the rollers, how to avoid drips. They got more paint on themselves than the walls, but their laughter filled the house. Look, Sophie called, pointing to a heart she'd painted near her bed. Perfect, Harold said, even though the paint was running slightly. They worked all day, stopping only for lunch. By evening, the room was transformed. The lavender walls made everything feel soft and new. "Can we put up our pictures now?" Sarah asked, pulling some photos from her backpack. Harold helped them arrange the frames. School photos, snapshots from the community center, a few older pictures they kept safe through all their moves. "There's room for more," Harold said. "We'll take lots of new ones." That night, after another round of goodnight hugs, Harold sat in his garden. The roses needed pruning, but he'd been too busy to tend them. "You'd love them, Martha," he said quietly to the flowers. "They're amazing girls." The back door creaked open. Both twins stood there in their new pajamas. "Dad," Sophie called. "We can't sleep. Want to help me with the roses?" They nodded eagerly, running out to join him. Harold showed them how to identify dead leaves, how to carefully cut them away to let new grow through. "Will they grow better now?" Sarah asked. Harold looked at his girls, their faces serious as they tended the plants. "Yeah," he said. "I think everything's going to grow better now." Harold woke to the sound of coughing. Harsh, deep coughs that shouldn't come from a child. He threw off his covers and hurried down the hall to the girls' room. Sarah sat up in bed, her body shaking with each cough. Sophie stood beside her, rubbing her sister's back. "She's been coughing all night," Sophie said, her eyes wide with worry. Harold pressed his hand to Sarah's forehead. Her skin burned against his palm. "I'm okay," Sarah wheezed between coughs. "Just a cold. You're not okay, sweetheart?" Harold checked his watch. 5:30 a.m. "We're going to the doctor." Sarah shook her head. "Don't want to be trouble." "You're never trouble." Harold helped her out of bed. "Sophie, can you help your sister get dressed while I make some calls?" Sophie nodded seriously, already pulling clothes from their dresser. Harold's hand shook as he dialed the 24-hour clinic. Sarah's cough echoed down the hallway, followed by the sound of retching. "Dad!" Sophie called, panic in her voice. He found Sarah in the bathroom, throwing up. Her face was pale except for 2 bright spots of fever on her cheeks. "Change of plans," he said, scooping her up. "We're going to the emergency room." The drive to the hospital was tense. Sarah lay across the back seat, her head in Sophie's lap. Her breathing came in wheezes. "Remember when Mom got sick?" Sophie whispered to her sister. "And she went away for a while." Sarah nodded weakly. "You're not going away," Sophie said firmly. "Dad won't let you." Harold's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The emergency room was nearly empty at that early hour. A nurse took one look at Sarah and rushed them into an examination room. "How long has she been coughing?" the doctor asked after listening to Sarah's lungs. "Started yesterday," Harold said. "Got worse through the night." The doctor frowned. "Her oxygen levels are low. We need to run some tests." Sophie refused to leave her sister's side as they took blood samples and x-rays. Harold stood in the corner, feeling helpless as Sarah endured each procedure without complaint. Finally, the doctor returned with the results. "She has severe pneumonia," he said, showing Harold the x-rays. "See these white areas? Her lungs are filling with fluid. She needs immediate treatment." Harold stared at the cloudy images. "What kind of treatment?" "For antibiotics, oxygen therapy, and—" The doctor hesitated. "There's a specialist procedure that could help clear her lungs more quickly. But it's not covered by standard insurance." "How much?" The doctor wrote a number on his prescription pad. Harold's stomach dropped, but he nodded. "Do it. Whatever she needs." "Dad," Sarah called weakly from the bed. "I'm sorry." Harold went to her side, taking her small hand. "Nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. But it's expensive. Even sick." She was thinking of others. Harold kissed her forehead. "Don't you worry about that. Your job is to get better." The nurses came to move Sarah to a proper room. Sophie trailed behind, still holding her sister's hand. "I have to stay with her," Sophie insisted when a nurse tried to guide her to the waiting room. "She's right," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "We stay together." The nurse looked at Harold, who nodded. They've never been separated. They made an exception, bringing in a reclining chair for Sophie to sleep in. Harold watched as his daughters held hands across the space between bed and chair, neither willing to let go. While Sarah slept, Harold stepped into the hallway to make a call. "Martina's Classic Cars." "Joe, it's Harold Thompson." "Harold, how are those girls of yours?" "Sarah's sick. In the hospital." Harold's voice cracked. "Remember when you offered to buy my '57 Chevy?" A pause. Harold, that car's your baby. You restored it yourself. The offer's still good. Course it is. But I need the money, Joe. Today if possible. Another pause. Bring it by whenever you're ready. Harold hung up and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. That car had been his retirement project, something to keep him busy after Martha died. But looking through the window at his girls, he knew it wasn't even a choice. Sophie came out to find him. Sarah's asking for you. He followed her back into the room. Sarah lay propped up on pillows, an oxygen mask covering her face. Her eyes were glassy with fever. Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling? She tried to smile behind the mask. Tired? Then rest. Sophie and I will be right here. Promise. Her voice was small, frightened. Promise. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead. We're not going anywhere. Later, while both girls slept, Harold's neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. Patricia from the center called, she said. Told me what happened. Harold nodded, too tired to speak. Mrs. Rodriguez set a bag on the table. Brought you some food. Coffee too. She looked at the girls. They're good kids, Harold. I was wrong before. Thank you, he managed. I can stay with Sophie sometimes, if you need. Give her a break from the hospital. Sophie stirred in her chair. I'm staying with Sarah. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Of course you are, honey. But if you change your mind. The next few days passed in a blur of doctors, nurses, and beeping machines. Harold signed papers authorizing the specialist treatment, not letting himself think about the cost. He sold the Chevy to Joe, who paid in cash and promised to take good care of it. The money would cover most of the treatment, but not all. Sarah slowly improved. Her fever broke on the 4th day, and her breathing grew stronger. Sophie never left her side, telling her stories and helping her eat. The roses, Sarah said one evening, her voice clearer without the mask. They'll die if we don't take care of them. Harold chuckled. That's what you're worried about. She nodded seriously. They're getting better. Like me. They'll wait for us, he assured her. We'll take care of them together when you're strong enough. On the 6th day, the doctor said they could go home. Sarah was still weak, but her lungs were clear. As Harold helped her into the car, she asked, Where's your old car, Dad? He focused on buckling her seatbelt. Sold it. Because of me. Her eyes filled with tears. Hey now. He cupped her face in his hands. You're worth more than any car. Worth more than anything. Sophie hugged her sister. We're together. That's what matters. Driving home, Harold watched his daughters in the rearview mirror. Sarah leaned against Sophie, both of them looking out the window at the familiar streets. The grandfather clock chimed as they walked in, welcoming them home. The roses waited in the garden, and tomorrow they would tend them together. Some things were worth any price. Sophie stood at the front of her 4th grade classroom, clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hands. The teacher, Mrs. Bennett, gave her an encouraging nod. My family, Sophie began reading. Most people think families have to match. Same color, same age, same everything. But my family proves them wrong. The other students watched, some whispering among themselves. Sophie's voice grew stronger. My dad is old and white, and some people think that's weird. But he sold his favorite car to pay for my sister's hospital bills. He helps us with homework and teaches us about roses. He makes us feel safe. In the back of the classroom, Harold sat quietly, his heart swelling with pride. Mrs. Bennett had invited parents to hear the children's presentations, and he'd taken time off work to attend. Sarah and I are twins, and we're black. Before Dad adopted us, nobody wanted both of us. They said 2 kids were too much trouble. But Dad says we're worth more than anything. A phone buzzed in Harold's pocket. He ignored it. So maybe we don't look like other families. Maybe people stare at us in stores or ask weird questions. But we love each other, and that's what makes a real family. The class applauded. Sophie beamed, her eyes finding Harold's. He gave her a thumbs up, blinking back tears. The phone buzzed again. Harold stepped into the hallway to check it. 3 missed calls from Ms. Jenkins. His stomach dropped. He dialed her back. Mr. Thompson, she answered immediately. We need to meet. Today. What's wrong? Someone filed a complaint about Sarah's hospitalization. Harold's mouth went dry. What kind of complaint? They're questioning your ability to care for the girls. Your age, the medical expenses. She paused. It would be better to discuss this in person. The classroom door opened, and Sophie bounced out. "Dad, Mrs. Bennet gave me an A." Harold forced a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Listen, we need to pick up Sarah and make a quick stop." "Okay." At the middle school, Sarah waited by the front doors. Her health had improved over the past month, but she's still tired easily. "Everything okay, Dad?" she asked, noticing his expression. "Just fine," he lied. "Got a meeting to get to." The social services office hadn't changed. Same plastic chairs, same ticking clock. The girl sat outside while Harold met with Ms. Jenkins. She slid a paper across her desk. The complaint was anonymous, but detailed. They cited the hospital incident as evidence of inadequate financial planning. They also mentioned your age as a concern. Harold read the complaint, his hands shaking with anger. "I got her the treatment she needed. What was I supposed to do? Let her suffer?" "Of course not. But the complaint raises valid concerns about long-term care." "Valid concerns?" Harold's voice rose. "I've given those girls everything. A home, stability, love, Mr. Thompson." Ms. Jenkins held up her hand. "I'm on your side. But I have to investigate all complaints." Outside the office, Sarah and Sophie pressed their ears to the door. "They want to take us away," Sophie whispered. Sarah grabbed her sister's hand. "Dad won't let them." Inside, Ms. Jenkins sighed. "There will be another home study. Interviews with teachers, doctors, neighbors. Standard procedure. And the girls? They can stay with you during the investigation." "But Harold," her voice softened. "Be prepared. Some people won't understand your family." Harold stood. "Then they're the ones with the problem." At home, the girls were unusually quiet. Harold found them in their room, sitting close together on Sarah's bed. "We heard," Sarah said. Harold sat beside them. "Everything's going to be okay. Promise." Sophie's voice trembled. "Promise." He pulled them both into a hug. "Nobody's separating this family." That night, Harold couldn't sleep. The grandfather clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2. He went to check on the girls and found them both in Sarah's bed, holding hands even in sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Bennet called. "Mr. Thompson?" "About Sophie's presentation yesterday." Harold braced himself. "It was beautiful," she continued. "And I want to help. If social services needs a reference, I'd be honored." Harold's throat tightened. "Thank you." More support came. Patricia from the community center wrote a glowing letter. Mrs. Rodriguez told anyone who would listen about how Harold had sold his car for Sarah's treatment. But there were others. Parents who pulled their children away at school pickup. Whispers at the grocery store. Anonymous calls to social services. Sarah found him in the garden one evening, tending the roses that were finally blooming. "Dad?" "Yeah, sweetheart. If they take us away." She swallowed hard. "Will you forget us?" Harold dropped his pruning shears. "Come here." She sat beside him on the garden bench. In the fading light, she looked so young, so vulnerable. "Listen to me," he said. "You and Sophie are my daughters. Nothing and nobody can change that. Not social services, not complaints, not anyone. But what if? No, what ifs?" He took her hands in his. "We're family. Forever." The next week brought the home study. A different social worker this time, younger than Ms. Jenkins. She inspected every room, asked endless questions. "The girls seem happy," she admitted, watching Sarah and Sophie do homework at the kitchen table. "They are happy," Harold said firmly. "But you have to understand our concerns. Your age, the financial situation after the hospital stay. You want to know if I can take care of them." Harold's voice was quiet but intense. "Look at their grades. Look at their health records. Look at this home. Those girls were in the system for 2 years before I found them. Ask them if they want to go back." The social worker glanced at the twins, who watched the conversation with worried eyes. "We just want what's best for them. I'm what's best for them." Harold stood straighter. "And they are what's best for me." That evening, Harold sat in his garden while the girls did their homework. The roses Martha had planted were blooming better than ever, tended by 3 pairs of loving hands. His phone rang. "Ms. Jenkins." "The investigation is complete," she said. Harold held his breath. "The complaint has been dismissed. You can breathe now, Harold." He did, letting out a long exhale. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank the community that stood up for you. Mrs. Bennet, Patricia, your neighbors." They all testified to what those girls mean to you. Harold watched through the window as his daughters worked at the kitchen table, heads bent together over their books. They mean everything, he said simply. That night, he called the girls into the living room. Got something to show you. He pulled out a folder. Remember that complaint? Well, look at this. He showed them the dismissal letter, then the stack of testimonials. Mrs. Bennett's letter, Patricia's statement, even a petition signed by parents and teachers. All these people stood up for us. Sophie asked, amazed. For our family, Harold corrected. Sarah hugged him tight. We knew you wouldn't let them take us. Never, he promised. We're stuck with each other now. The grandfather clock chimed, but its ticking was drowned out by the sound of laughter as Harold tickled his daughters, their fears forgotten in the joy of being together. Sophie held her phone under the covers, the screen's glow illuminating her face in the darkness. Sarah lay beside her, both girls trying to keep quiet so Harold wouldn't hear them. Press record, Sarah whispered. Sophie's finger hovered over the button. You sure about this? He needs to know. Everyone needs to know. Sophie pressed record. Sarah spoke softly but clearly. The first time I met our dad, I was scared. Everyone who said they wanted to help us before had left. But Dad was different. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. The girls quickly turned off the phone and pretended to sleep. Harold's footsteps passed their door, followed by the familiar sound of him checking the locks before bed. That's good for tonight, Sophie whispered once his footsteps faded. We'll film more tomorrow. In the morning, Harold made pancakes while the girls got ready for school. He noticed them whispering and giggling more than usual, sharing secret looks across the table. What are you two up to? He asked, sliding more pancakes onto their plates. Nothing, they said in unison, which usually meant something. Harold smiled. After the investigation, seeing them happy and mischievous was a relief. Dad? Sarah asked. Can we use your old video camera? The one in the closet. Sure. But what for? School project, Sophie said quickly. Too quickly. Harold raised an eyebrow but didn't push. The girls had earned his trust, and a little mystery never hurt anyone. At school, the twins' teacher, Ms. Carter, pulled Harold aside during pickup. Mr. Thompson, I wanted to show you something. She handed him 2 papers. The twins' latest test scores. Top of the class, she said proudly. Both of them. Harold stared at the A+ marks, his vision blurring slightly. They've come so far since you adopted them, Ms. Carter continued. Whatever you're doing, it's working. In the car, Harold couldn't stop smiling. So, he said casually, Ms. Carter showed me your test scores. The girls exchanged glances in the back seat. Are you mad? Sarah asked. Harold nearly slammed the brakes. Mad? Why would I be mad about my daughters being the smartest kids in their class? Some kids said. Sophie hesitated. They said we only got good grades because teachers feel sorry for us. Because of, you know. Harold's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Because I'm old? Because we don't look alike. The girls nodded. He pulled into their driveway and turned to face them. Listen to me. You got those grades because you're smart and hardworking. Anyone who says different is just jealous. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and hugged him. Sophie joined from the other side. Can we get ice cream to celebrate? Sophie asked. Harold laughed. You bet we can. Later that evening, while Harold watched TV, the girl snuck into the backyard with his camera. Talk about the roses, Sophie directed, pointing the camera at her sister. Sarah knelt by the flower bed. These were our grandmother's roses. We never met her, but Dad says she would have loved us. When I was sick, I worried they'd die because no one was taking care of them. But Dad said they'd wait for us. And they did. Inside, Harold dozed in his armchair. The grandfather clock chimed 9, waking him. He went to check on the girls and found their room empty. Panic flashed through him before he heard their voices in the garden. He watched through the window as they filmed each other, talking and laughing. Whatever they were up to, they were happy. That's what mattered. The next day at school, Sophie stood nervously in front of her class. For the talent show, she announced, Sarah and I want to do something different. Not singing or dancing. We want to show a video. Mrs. Bennett looked intrigued. What kind of video? It's a surprise. But it's important. After school, the girls spent hours in their room with the camera and Sophie's phone, whispering and editing. Harold brought them dinner on trays. Don't stay up too late? Okay. Just a little longer, Sarah pleaded. We're almost done. Done with what? You'll see, Sophie said mysteriously. That night, Harold found Sophie's diary on the kitchen table. He knew he shouldn't read it, but a page was open, and his name caught his eye. Dad sold his car for Sarah, Sophie had written. He says we're worth more than anything. I didn't know dads could be like this. Real dads. Forever dads. Harold closed the diary, his hand shaking. He returned it to Sophie's desk while they slept. The next morning, Mrs. Rodriguez came over with a casserole. The girls came by yesterday, she said. Asked me to talk about you on camera. Hope that's okay. Harold nearly dropped the casserole dish. They what? Oh. Mrs. Rodriguez covered her mouth. I think I wasn't supposed to tell you that. More clues emerged. Patricia from the community center mentioned an interview. Ms. Jenkins admitted the girls had called her. They are very determined, she said. Whatever they are planning. The talent show was a week away. Harold watched the girls practice their presentation in the living room, but they shooed him away whenever he got too close. No peeking, Sophie insisted. Finally, the night before the show, Sarah approached him in the garden. Dad, are you coming tomorrow? Wouldn't miss it for the world. She hugged him tight. Good. Because it's all for you. Harold knelt down to her level. What do you mean? But she just smiled and ran back inside. That night, he heard them talking in their room. Think he'll like it? Sophie asked. He has too, Sarah replied. It's our story. Our family's story. Harold lay awake for hours, wondering what his daughters had created. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time until morning. In his dreams, he saw Martha. She stood in her rose garden, smiling. You did good, she said. Real good? He woke to the sounds of the girls getting ready, their excitement filling the house. Dad! Sophie called. We need to get to school early. Coming. As he drove them to school, Harold noticed both girls clutching their backpacks tightly. Nervous? He asked. They nodded. Don't be. Whatever you've done, I'm already proud of you. Sarah reached forward and squeezed his shoulder. We're proud of you too, Dad. The school parking lot was full. Parents and teachers filed into the auditorium for the talent show. Sit in the front row, Sophie instructed. And? She bit her lip. Maybe have tissues ready. Harold found his seat, his heart pounding with anticipation. The lights dimmed. The first acts passed in a blur. Singers, dancers, a boy with a trumpet. Then the principal announced, Sarah and Sophie Thompson. His daughters walked onto the stage, holding hands. This is for our dad, they said together. The screen behind them lit up. The auditorium fell silent as the screen flickered to life. Harold leaned forward in his seat, his heart pounding. Sarah's face appeared first, sitting in their garden. Everyone thinks they know what family looks like, she began. But sometimes the best families are the ones nobody expects. The image shifted to Sophie, standing by the grandfather clock. 2 years ago, nobody wanted us. We were too old, they said. Too much trouble. Then we met our dad. Old footage played, showing Harold at the community center, helping the girls with homework. Harold didn't even know they had this video. Patricia's face appeared next. I remember the day Harold met the twins, she said, smiling. Something just clicked. He didn't see 2 troubled kids. He saw 2 little girls who needed love. The screen showed Mrs. Rodriguez speaking from her porch. I was wrong about them at first, she admitted. Thought it was strange, him adopting at his age. But watch him with those girls. That's what real family looks like. Harold's vision blurred. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Ms. Jenkins sitting behind him. On screen, Ms. Jenkins spoke from her office. In all my years of social work, I've never seen a family fight harder to stay together. When Sarah got sick, Harold sold his prize car without hesitation. That's not just dedication. That's love. The video cut to Sarah in a hospital bed, pale but smiling. Dad stayed with us every night. He said I was worth more than any car. Sophie's voice narrated over footage of their garden. The roses were our grandmother's. Dad says she would have loved us. When Sarah was sick, we were afraid they'd die. But Dad said they'd wait for us. Just like he did. Mrs. Bennett appeared, seated at her desk. Sophie wrote an essay about her family, she said, holding up a paper. She wrote that families don't have to match on the outside if they match on the inside. The screen showed clips of their daily life. Harold making breakfast, helping with homework, tending the roses together. Small moments that meant everything. Some people didn't understand, Sarah's voice continued. They said mean things. Tried to split us up. The image changed to both girls sitting on their bed. But Dad never let us go, Sophie said. He promised we'd stay together. And he keeps his promises, Sarah added. More community members appeared, teachers, neighbors, even the doctor who treated Sarah. Harold Thompson is what every father should be, the doctor said. He puts his children first, always. The video showed Harold asleep in his armchair, a storybook open on his lap. The girls curled up next to him, also sleeping. We used to be scared to sleep, Sophie's voice said. But not anymore, because Dad checks on us every night. Make sure we're safe. Sarah appeared in their garden, touching a blooming rose. Like these flowers, our family grew from something small into something beautiful. The screen split, showing both girls. So maybe we don't look like other families, they said in unison. Maybe people don't understand. But we know what family means. The final shot showed all three of them in the garden, laughing as they planted new roses. Harold didn't remember who had taken that photo. This is for you, Dad, the girls' voices said. Happy 70th birthday. We love you. The screen faded to black. For a moment, the auditorium was completely silent. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in. Soon the whole room was on their feet. Harold couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His daughters ran down from the stage and threw themselves into his arms. Surprise, Sophie whispered. How? Harold's voice cracked. How did you do all this? We've been working on it for months, Sarah explained. Everyone helped. The whole community wanted to show support. Ms. Jenkins said from behind them. These girls are quite the filmmakers. The principal approached their group, wiping her eyes. That was extraordinary. Would you mind if we showed this at other schools? I think people need to see it. Before Harold could answer, a local news reporter stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, I'd love to do a story about your family. This is exactly what people need to hear right now. The girls looked at Harold questioningly. He pulled them closer. It's up to you, he said. Your story, your choice. They shared one of their twin looks. We want to tell it, Sophie said firmly. So other families like us know they are not alone, Sarah added. The reporter knelt down to their level. Would you be comfortable if I interviewed you? All of you? Harold looked at his daughters' eager faces and nodded. That afternoon, their living room transformed into a makeshift TV studio. The reporter, Lisa Chen, sat across from them as cameras rolled. What made you decide to create this documentary? She asked the twins. People kept saying we weren't a real family, Sophie explained. Because Dad's old? Or because we're different colors, Sarah continued. But that's not what makes a family. They finished together. Lisa turned to Harold. And you had no idea they were making this. He shook his head, smiling. They're good at keeping secrets when they want to be. The community's response has been overwhelming, Lisa noted. Teachers, doctors, social workers, all speaking up for your family. Because they saw what we knew all along, Sarah said. Dad's the best dad ever. Harold squeezed her hand. After the interview, Mrs. Rodriguez brought over dinner. You're going to be famous, she teased. We just wanted to show people what Dad did for us, Sophie said. And what you did for him, Mrs. Rodriguez replied softly. That house was so quiet before you came. That night, after the cameras left and the excitement died down, Harold found his daughters in the garden. Thank you, he said simply. For what? Sarah asked. For choosing me. For letting me be your dad. Sophie hugged him. You chose us first. When nobody else would. Best choice I ever made. They sat together among the roses, watching the sunset. The grandfather clock chimed inside, but its ticking didn't sound lonely anymore. Dad? Sarah asked. Can we plant more roses? Different colors. Harold looked at his daughters, these amazing girls who had filled his life with love and purpose. We can plant anything you want, he said. We've got all the time in the world. Harold's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Ever since Lisa Chen's news story aired the night before, calls had been pouring in from across the state. Another interview request, he told the girls over breakfast. Some national morning show this time. Sarah looked up from her cereal. Can we do it? You want to? The twins shared a glance before Sophie spoke. If it helps other families like us, yeah. Harold's phone buzzed again. A text from Ms. Jenkins. Check your email. The video's gone viral. He opened his laptop at the kitchen table. The girls' documentary had over 1 million views on social media. "Look at the comments," Sophie said, pointing at the screen. "I'm a senior citizen thinking about adoption." Harold read aloud. "This family gave me hope." Sarah leaned closer. "Read another one. My husband and I were told we weren't the right race to adopt our foster kids. This story made us fight harder." The doorbell rang. Mrs. Rodriguez stood on the porch with a stack of newspapers. "Your front page news," she said, handing them over. The headline read, "Local Family Challenges Adoption Stereotypes." Below it, a photo showed Harold and the twins in their garden. "The phone's been ringing at the community center too," Mrs. Rodriguez added. People wanting to know about senior adoption programs. Before Harold could respond, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Ms. Jenkins stepped out, looking excited. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, "but this couldn't wait." She spread papers across their kitchen table. "Applications, statistics, reports. Since your story aired, our office has received 43 inquiries about adoption, 15 specifically from senior citizens." She beamed at the girls. "Your video is changing lives." The twins high-fived each other. "That's not all," Ms. Jenkins continued. "The State Adoption Board wants to start a program encouraging senior citizens to consider adoption. They'd like you to be the spokesperson." Harold. He blinked. "Me? Who better? You've shown it can work. That love doesn't have an age limit." Before he could answer, his phone rang again. The school principal. "Mr. Thompson? We've had calls from other districts. They want to show the documentary at their schools. Would your family be willing to speak at some assemblies?" Harold looked at his daughters. They nodded enthusiastically. "We'll do it," he said. The next week passed in a whirlwind. The morning show sent a car to pick them up. The girls charmed the hosts, telling their story with confidence and grace. "What would you say to other kids in the system?" the host asked. "Don't give up," Sarah said. "Your family might not look like everyone else's, but they are out there," Sophie finished. After the show, a woman approached them in tears. "I'm 68, she said. "My husband died last year. I've been so lonely. But I never believed I could still be a mother." Harold gave her Ms. Jenkins' card. Back home, more surprises waited. A letter had arrived from the girl's biological mother. Harold recognized a handwriting from old school forms. His hands shook as he gave it to the twins. "Want me to leave while you read it?" They shook their heads. "Stay," Sophie said. The letter was short but sincere. Their mother was doing better. 1 year sober. She'd seen them on TV. "I'm proud of you," she wrote. "Proud of who you've become. And grateful to the man who gave you what I couldn't." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Can we write back?" "If you want to," Harold said gently. "Tell her about the roses," Sophie suggested. "And Dad's cooking." A magazine wanted to do a feature on their family. The photographer set up in their garden, now bursting with blooms of every color. "The roses represent our family," Sarah explained during the interview. "Different colors, but growing together. Growing stronger," Sophie added. The article came out a month later. "Love Blooms: How One Unconventional Family Changed Adoption." The cover showed Harold and the twins among their roses, all three laughing at something off camera. Ms. Jenkins organized an adoption awareness event at the community center. Families of all kinds shared their stories. Harold watched his daughters move through the crowd, answering questions, offering encouragement. "You've started something remarkable," Ms. Jenkins told him. "People are rethinking everything they believed about what makes a family." A local business owner approached Harold. "My wife and I have been fostering a teenager. Everyone said we were too old to adopt her. But after seeing your story, do it," Harold said. "Age is just a number. Love is what matters." That evening, the local news ran a follow-up story. 1 month after their viral documentary, the Thompson family continues to inspire change. State adoption policies are under review. Senior adoption programs are launching nationwide. The camera showed clips from their morning show appearance, their magazine photo shoot, the adoption awareness event. Thanks to 2 young filmmakers and their determined father, families across the country are discovering that love knows no boundaries. Sarah and Sophie sat on either side of Harold on the couch, watching themselves on TV. "Did you ever think this would happen?" Sophie asked. Harold shook his head. "Never dreamed of it." "Are you glad it did?" Sarah looked up at him. He pulled them both close. glad doesn't begin to cover it. The grandfather clock chimed in the background. Outside, their roses bloomed in the evening light. Later, Harold found a new entry in Sophie's diary, left open on the kitchen table like a gift. People used to stare at us because we were different. Now they stare because we're changing things. Dad says sometimes the best families are the ones nobody expects. He's right. We're proof. The phone rang again. Another interview request, another family seeking hope, another life they might change. Sarah answered it this time. Thompson residence, she said proudly. Harold watched his daughter, remembering the quiet girl who'd once been afraid to speak above a whisper. Now she was helping others find their voice. Dad! Sophie called from the garden. Come look. The new roses are blooming. He joined her outside. A fresh batch of roses had opened, adding splashes of yellow and pink to their colorful garden. Beautiful, he said. Like our family, Sophie replied. Inside, the phone kept ringing. Their story wasn't over. It was still blooming, still growing, still changing lives. Just like their roses. 1 year after the documentary first played in their school auditorium, Harold sat in the same front row seat. This time, the room was packed with families from across the state. Welcome to the first annual Family Diversity Celebration, the principal announced. 1 year ago, 2 remarkable students showed us what family truly means. Please welcome Sarah and Sophie Thompson. The twins walked onto the stage, taller now but still holding hands. The audience erupted in applause. A year ago, we made a video about our dad, Sarah began. We thought we were just telling our story, Sophie continued. But it became everyone's story. They played the documentary again. Harold knew every frame by heart now, but it still brought tears to his eyes. When the lights came up, the twins remained on stage. Since we made this video, Sarah said, 58 senior citizens in our state have adopted children. 342 families like ours have formed nationwide, Sophie added. And our dad. Sarah smiled at Harold. He's the best dad ever. After the presentation, families crowded around them. An elderly woman hugged Harold, introducing the young boy beside her. We adopted Tommy last month, she said. Because of your story. Tommy grinned, showing a missing front tooth. I got a forever family too. More families shared their stories. A senior couple with teenage twins. A grandfather raising his 3 adopted grandchildren. Each one thanking them for showing the way. Back home, Harold found the girls in the garden. They'd grown so much in the past year, not just in height but in confidence. Dad? Sophie called. We have another surprise. Sarah pulled out an envelope. Remember how you sold your car for my hospital bills? Harold nodded. Well, Sophie bounced on her toes. The community took up a collection. All the families you helped, all the people who saw our video. Sarah handed him the envelope. Inside was a check that made Harold's hands shake. It's enough to buy back your car, Sophie explained. Mr. Martinez kept it safe, waiting. Girls, Harold's voice cracked. I can't accept this. Yes, you can, Sarah insisted. You gave up everything for us. Let us give something back. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Rodriguez stood there with a cake. Happy 1-year anniversary, she said. More neighbors arrived, carrying food and flowers. Ms. Jenkins came with a thick folder. Latest adoption statistics, she said proudly. Your family started a movement, Harold. The community center staff showed up, led by Patricia. Even Mrs. Bennett brought her family. The house filled with laughter and conversation. Children played in the garden while adults shared stories of their own adoption journeys. Remember when people used to stare at us in stores? Sophie asked, sitting beside Harold on the porch steps. Now they ask for autographs, Sarah laughed. Harold watched his daughters mingle with the crowd. They moved with easy confidence, switching between helping younger kids and chatting with adults. The grandfather clock struck 6, barely audible over the party noise. Harold remembered when its ticking was the only sound in his empty house. Ms. Jenkins joined him on the steps. Quite a difference from that first day in my office. Never thought we'd end up here. You proved them all wrong. She smiled. The girls' grades came in, by the way. Top of their class again. A car pulled up, and Lisa Chen stepped out with her camera crew. Hope we're not late, she called. The network wants to do an anniversary special. The twins rushed to greet her. They'd grown comfortable with cameras over the past year, using their platform to advocate for other families. Mr. Thompson. A quiet voice drew his attention. A man stood nearby, looking nervous. Could I ask your advice? About senior adoption. Harold spent the next hour talking with him, sharing their experience, offering encouragement. As the sun set, someone suggested taking a group photo. Families gathered in the garden, surrounded by blooming roses. Want to know a secret? Sarah whispered to Harold as they posed. Sophie and I are making another documentary. Oh! About all the families that formed because of our first one. Sophie grinned. It's going to be even better. The camera flashed, capturing the moment. Harold looked around at the crowd in his garden. Every family different, every story unique, all connected by love. Later, after the guests left and the house grew quiet, Harold found a new entry in Sophie's diary. She'd left it open again, a habit she'd developed over the past year. A year ago, we made a video to show Dad how much we loved him. We didn't know it would change everything. Now there are families like ours everywhere. Dad says that's what love does. It grows and spreads and makes room for more. Like our roses. The girls were in their room, working on their new documentary. Harold could hear them talking and laughing. He went to the garden and touched one of Martha's original roses, still blooming after all these years. You'd be so proud of them, he whispered. Dad! The twins stood in the doorway. Can we interview you for the new documentary? What's this one about? They sat beside him on the garden bench. It's about how love doesn't care about age or color or what other people think, Sarah explained. It's about how families find each other, Sophie added. Like we found you. Harold pulled them close. Like we found each other. The grandfather clock chimed inside, its familiar sound mixing with the evening birdsong. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more families seeking advice, more lives to touch. But right now, in their garden surrounded by roses of every color, Harold Thompson sat with his daughters and knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ready for the interview? Sophie asked, holding up her camera. Harold smiled. Ready for anything, with you two by my side. The camera started recording as the last sunlight painted their garden in gold. 3 different people, 1 perfect family, showing the world what love really means. And somewhere, a lonely child watched their story and dared to hope. Somewhere, an elderly person considered opening their heart and home. Somewhere, another unexpected family bloomed. Just like their roses,